Chris Wirz from the National Center for Atmospheric Research will be presenting on a study of risk communication. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to him.
All right, hopefully you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right, sounds good. So that was a great setup and makes my job a lot easier because I don't have to set up the December 10th events because Derek just did a perfect job. What I'm going to do is kind of come through with a little bit different information. So walking through the same events here, but really looking at risk communication specifically and looking at those forecaster perspectives as well as the core partners and then public. And just to give context on where this project's coming from, I'm a postdoc working with Julie Demuth at NCAR, so National Center for Atmospheric Research in the MESOSCALE Microscope Meteorology Lab. So this is a collaboration between the two of us here, and hopefully I can move my screen ahead and you can see that. But I want to start with a huge thank you first to Ali and Randy for inviting us to give this talk and be able to share this research with you all, but also to everyone that made this study possible. So first to my lab and NCAR for funding the fieldwork and travel, but also thanks to Central Region for everyone's support and interest in this project, as well as to Derek from the Paducah FO for getting it started, kind of in a weird way by accident, talking about something else, and we kind of dovetailed into this project. And then for Steve Eddy and Pat Spoden with the Paducah office for welcoming us in and lots of great conversations and perspectives while I was visiting there, as well as a thank you to Christine Weiglos, who essentially helped get the data collection started by connecting me with all the different core partners and people from the public. That was really valuable and wouldn't have happened without that. And then to everyone at the Paducah FO for hosting me and again, kind of answering my stupid questions and indulging me on kind of doing interviews and all those different ways to help me understand the situation a little bit better. And then last but not least to everyone else who did the interviews with me, which I'm going to talk about now. And so I changed this where I had a quick refresher on the December 10 to 11 tornadoes, but it looks like I don't need to do that. And I have just put a quick edit of it. Thanks to Derek for covering this in detail, because really covered the fundamentals perfectly. But it did really impact the Paducah FO and that county warning area, as you can see here. And so I'm going to focus on that specific area and that specific office, not quite as regional as Derek was. And so with that perspective, I want to think about what's been done social science-wise in this area. And we've been in the field looking at past tornado research in a couple different ways. So looking at things from like mobile homes and the predictive actions you can take to kind of digging into this idea of what we mean by complacency or confidence and information seeking in tornado myths. And so then what I'm doing here is like bringing in communication theory, which is where my background is. So thinking about things like media systems, we know from communication that like the structure of a system is going to impact how media and communication works. So thinking at like the country level, your government or kind of like the incentive structure of a kind of news system is going to impact the content and how those things are done, as well as what media scholars call communication repertoires. So knowing that no one just looks at one piece of information, and increasingly now you're looking probably at TV and maybe you're still looking at a newspaper, but you're looking at apps and social media and all that stuff and kind of understanding the interplay of all these things. And so bringing these together, the goal of this study is really understand that kind of what we're going to call the communication environment or communication landscape. Talk about like thinking from operational forecasting perspective, the environment is really important meteorologically, but it's also important socially. So thinking of like how these different factors are coming together, like what's important for communication, and that's what we dig into. And by that I mean thinking about like what are the pathways that you can communicate with, whether that be formal, like sending out products, or informal, things like texting or calling some people or partners in your area. How are you getting information? And then the importance of these pathways at different times. So some tools may be really helpful early on, but maybe not so helpful as you get closer to the event or during the event. And then also looking from a communication perspective, where are the successes and potential gaps that could be addressed there? And then kind of with another question there too of how does this then relate to the physical environment for the event? So we have this kind of communication landscape, but also each event is going to be kind of different. And so thinking about for this one, there's an early signal, it was on the ground for a long time. So there's an on the ground lead time, but also days in advance lead time. How does that impact communication? As well as the severity and kind of the nature of the specific event. How did that like kind of impact the communication overall? And so to do this, I've hinted at that there's some interviews. We did 40 semi-structured interviews, which means like I had some questions and topics I want to cover, but kind of let it be flexible on what we did. And so 11 of those were at the forecast office in Paducah. 6 of those were with emergency managers from their CWA. 4 of them were with broadcast meteorologists throughout the area. And then 19 of them were people from the public, so from different areas of the CWA, and mostly conducted in person, actually about a year ago. And so what we talked about was a little bit different with each group, but really focusing on communication information, successes and challenges, and then stories and kind of their experiences with this event. So then what I have synthesized here is essentially what I'm going to call this preliminary communication landscape. We're kind of just to demonstrate how dynamic and complex it is, which to most of you folks who work in operations, this is going to be somewhat old news, but I'm going to, because you know how you're communicating to other people. But what I'm going to layer on, which is hopefully interesting, is, you know, the perspective and insights of partners in the public, you know, so of these different pathways over different times. So kind of what I'll layer on is I'll put the map of where information and communication is going, and then I'll show you insights of what really resonated with people and what was really important and when, which will be somewhat interesting to you. And then 2, thinking about mapping out this landscape. I have this idea, and we start with guidance and observations, working with this in a forecast office, and then we make formal products here. And then that can look like, as you all know, things that are posted on the website, warnings, weather radio discussions, special weather statements, and these things are used to communicate with core partners. So like in the case I have mapped out here, broadcast meteorologists, emergency managers, and the public. Again, this is probably old news to most of you, but you also are like, there's way more ways we communicate, which is what we've mapped out here. You know, like knowing DSS packets are really important, as well as briefings with your partners. NWS chat, which we mentioned to you, also calls and text, kind of depending on your office, social media, and then public events. And so kind of laying out that there are many ways that you all know you're communicating with these different groups, but also important to kind of keep in mind that each of these groups are also doing their own communication. You know, so broadcasters obviously broadcasting their message and getting that stuff out there, but also, you know, sharing things on social media, or even maybe sharing their broadcast via social media. Emergency managers also doing that kind of layout where they're going to emailing, calling, texting people, reaching them maybe via social media or whatever the tools they have available to their audiences, as well as the public doing communication, right? So face-to-face, calls and texts, and social media. You know, people are always interacting with each other, and you know, weather's going to be a main topic in some of those conversations. And so with this landscape, I'm going to break it down by different event phases. And so I have phase 1, you know, the week leading up to the event, up until the day of the event, so like Sunday through Thursday for a Friday event. Phase 2, it can be the day of the event up until it entered the CWA, about Friday before 5 p.m. or so, and then right before and during the event. So when this, like the event was starting to occur and starting to pass through the CWA. I also have, I don't have listed here, but there's gonna be 4, and I'll talk about after a little bit too. And so what I'm doing here in this next diagram is kind of adapting these overall landscapes that you just saw based on which pathways were mentioned in these interviews and then how they were discussed. So you're going to see there's different weights. You know, this one was really important for these types of people. You know, this was, and this is why it was important. So I'll walk through. And so with the first one, kind of leading up to the event, you see the weight was really heavy on, you know, DSS packets and briefings. I heard a lot of partners saying that was really important. You know, those were the key things. And even here I have, you know, quote highlighting from the broadcaster perspective. And so what they said was, you know, we reference the DSS packets. And anytime there's a significant weather event, those are extremely helpful to us. You know, as a broadcaster, we don't necessarily, you know, copy paste, but it just helps to increase our confidence, make sure we're all on the same page and putting on a consistent message. And so just being like, not just for emergency managers or other types of partners, but also as helpful tool for broadcasters. It's also, I think, important to note that for this area, it's not a very competitive media market, and the forecast office has a really good relationship with the broadcasters in doing sorts of events and talking to each other and making sure the communication is key. And they seem to have that done pretty well, which I think if it was a more competitive media market, it might be a little bit different. But emergency managers also found those things really helpful. You kind of the nuts and bolts of what you need to know, and actually a lot of emergency managers talked about how when they get those DSS packets, they'll just forward them along to sometimes like 10, 20, up to like a couple hundred people. You know, like this is information, you know. They liked that it was pretty visual and really simple to understand. A lot of those messages, that was a consistent theme as well. Just like very palatable, what you need to know type of information. So it's been really key too. And then one of the forecasters talked about how actually in the week leading up to this event, there were actually many public events that were happening. So as the forecaster says, on Wednesday, I had a school talk with all the superintendents of the schools. It was supposed to be a, hey, we're going to involve you guys in decision making for winter weather, because this is in December. And I remember at the very end of the talk being like, y'all need to be watching Friday. Friday night's looking bad. So I plugged it there. And went on to talk about how then on Thursday, so like right before the event, having a Facebook Live session in Henderson, Kentucky, to kick off Winter Weather Awareness Week, which was happening then. And so they did Facebook Live where they talked about winter weather preparedness, but at the end, spent probably a good half hour, 45 minutes answering the public's questions about severe weather that was upcoming. So there was enough kind of hype and awareness, and this was like queuing into people's minds that they brought those questions to other events. And we're starting to kind of have those conversations, keying with the National Weather Service and see what was going on there. So those were also important ways to communicate. And then also I have a little kind of note here is that people started to build the buzz around the events. People in the public talked about how you kind of heard about it. People were saying, have you thought about Friday? You hear Friday looks bad. And that was starting to happen throughout the week too. As we switch into the day of the event, we started seeing a few different things highlight, where calls and texts start to become important, as well as NWS chat. And so one of the EMs pointed out that they really like NWS chat. It's got its issues, which we just heard about in the last presentation, but will hopefully be resolved. And in the way they use NWS chat, it's huge for us as far as bringing information to one spot. So we got our fingers crossed that they get those ironed out, because right now about every 90 minutes they crash. And so it was interesting listening to the EMs talk about how they used it, because they would do a few things where you could essentially watch how the system was moving by saying like when other EMs were starting to communicate in there, or if there's any sorts of like reports happening. But also they use it as a way to see if the broadcast forecasters agreed with the forecast office, kind of see like if they're all on the same page, it's like probably going to happen, and you kind of watch and see if maybe there's any hesitation. So using a couple different ways. And also broadcasters have reported that being useful too, a way to like kind of check in and see what's going on. And then for an emergency manager perspective here too, we talked about how they've done the webinar, and that it's essentially the office was like, this is not looking good, and there'll be a major outbreak. You can see by the damage that like I actually went to this county too, and the damage in the city was really bad. Like it was 4 months later, but it was pretty devastated still in this small town. And so he's referencing that damage, kind of pointing around that we only had 16 people die, which is amazing. And 16 is bad, don't get me wrong, but the number should have been like 4 or 5 times that, because typically you don't have 30 minutes lead time, and we did. It's also not typical lead time, because you see this, but for this event, there's heightened awareness that I was just kind of talking about with kind of buzz on social media and around town, because it was already being discussed in the media. The Weather Service was discussing it, and we were already discussing it internally. So kind of having that longer lead time where being able to hear it from briefings, the Monday ahead of time, and getting those DSS packets started that conversation. And so as people are kind of mentally preparing, if they're not like physically doing action, it helped a lot throughout that SOS system here. And so moving into like right before and sort of during the event, we have a few different points that I want to highlight. So kind of DSS packets and briefings are really important as things are hitting on the ground. And you do see that these are when the formal products are really helpful. Things that are starting to push to people's phone, like special weather statements or the tornado emergencies. Chat's really important, but it goes down, in some ways, and you could reroute and you can do different points. But if you're like a broadcaster and you're on air, you don't have a lot of time to be like, oh, I should reload this app, or I should check my email and stuff, because you've been essentially giving the weather live for maybe 4 or 5, 6 hours. So you don't really have that same system to be able to kind of manipulate and move things a little bit differently. You see broadcast meteorologists, like the broadcast being really key for people, as well as the social media feed of the broadcast. So the Facebook Live version, when you're taking essentially what's on the TV and pushing it to Facebook, also being key, because a lot of people didn't have subscriptions to TV or have TV set up. And then emergency managers talked about like calling and texting amongst their teams and different responders being really huge. Face-to-face conversation being big for people in the public. Calling, texting the person that doesn't watch the weather was also huge. People reported doing that a lot, and then seeing what was going on social media. And then also I want to highlight here too is that the interpersonal, like informal ways of communicating was really key for getting the forecasters to communicate with emergency managers. There are a few cases I want to read out here. This is from an EM who said they got a call, 8:45 from a forecaster, lead forecaster for that event from the National Weather Service in Paducah. He said, hey, I'm calling just to let you know, it looks like it's going to be catastrophic. And he says, it looks like it's going to stay south. And of course, I've never heard anybody say catastrophic. So I was like, oof, okay. And so I started calling fire chiefs on the south end and said, y'all get ready. So just talking about like having that direct communication is really key for leading the operations, because a lot of these towns are really small and have maybe limited resources in some of these things, or maybe not that many full-time staff. Because I think too, in highlighting this other EM is someone who does only work part-time, is only funded part-time, and has a pretty limited space in a small town, which he lovingly referred to as Mayberry when I was there. And so thinking this EM is walking through, and it's in 9:55, walking downstairs at their own home, because that was kind of, that's the safety protocol, right? Go home, you be safe, and then we can open the EOC after for this small town. And so you get a phone call. It was a WCM. She said, where are you at? And I said, I'm at my house. And she said, give me the directions from the city that they're near. And I said, northwest of the city. She goes, you're going to be fine. And she said, hold on a minute. And it was 10 o'clock. And she said, in 1 minute, it's coming across this local landmark. But she told me exactly where it was going at 10:10, 9 minutes after it hit. Our EOC was open because I had that personal communication from her. So just showing how important those channels were. And also, I think just like a deep understanding from the forecast office of like how to reach their people and the emergency managers and their core partners. I think this was a really good job of understanding, like representing that local understanding. And I think too, people from the public were also picking up on some of this language. And this person reports like the NWS kept, texting or, sending out messages, yeah, catastrophic tornado. And this is, 4 months later, and I still remember that word, which I think is really powerful. And that's when they knew it was serious. I could see the hook on the radar, and when it hit Mayfield, which is probably 20 miles south, primarily west of us, generally the weather comes out of that direction. So I was concerned at that point, and we all just kind of watched the radar. So just kind of seeing how people were using different tools and different communication platforms is really key here. And then another form he was just kind of focusing on the broadcasts. I mentioned they're important, but you had people talking about how the tone and what people were saying on air really resonated with them. And so this person was saying, then the news anchor said, like my neighborhood, kind of like, hey, it's headed right for you. So I was like, goes over to the husband, like, we get into the bathroom, like in the corner of the basement, like this is really serious. But not until like seeing kind of the tone that the broadcaster used, like, it really resonated in that same way. And then someone else points out, like, we knew we were going to lose power. When we pulled it up on our phones, like, the Facebook Live version of the TV broadcast. And while we could watch it, and even when we're in the closet, we were able to watch it, and right until it hit us. So like you could do this safe behavior instead of trying to like see the TV and going back and forth and decide when it's done, and just to be in the loop the whole time, which was really powerful for them. And a lot of people mentioned doing that same thing. And so then kind of moving on to the forecast office losing power, which Derek just hit on here. Pretty rough thing, but I'm going to kind of show a quote that I think represents the sentiment pretty well. And so going offline was extremely frustrating. This is one of the forecasters. It's probably one of the most frustrating nights. You can talk to someone else in the office who was the electronics guy here, and he tried everything. I mean, everything. He called a tow truck company. They're trying to jumpstart the generator with their batteries, and it's pouring down rain and lightning. And the look on his face just said it all. I mean, he was heartbroken. I felt the same way. I felt completely helpless, which I think kind of sits with you. It's a pretty powerful statement, but I then think the other part of this is also really key for the message. So I knew that Springfield had taken over the warnings, and when the power went out, they did it. They were doing a fantastic job. And the way that they were able to pick up our baton like that and do what they did is nothing short of extraordinary. And it really makes me proud to work for this agency, because they have people like that you work with that can do that. Which I think kind of represents that it is frustrating, but also that the mission overall was still maintained, and that was really important to people, that it worked well. And so dealing with that whole kind of aftermath, and then also surveying and messaging, people started hitting pretty hard about like, why don't we have the damage done, surveys done? Why aren't you seeing EFI? Why aren't you doing these things? It was kind of hard to work with in the aftermath of the big event. And then two, I think just like, it also highlights what Derek said too about kind of, it's hit everyone hard and leaves a long road of recovery and building. And so the events were challenging professionally, not just to the forecasters in the office, but also to like the core partners, right? So you have the broadcaster here saying the aftermath of the storm, we were really just emotionally drained after it. And the next morning, all you can think about is, did we do enough? What could we have done better to prevent any loss of life at all? And then the forecaster is talking about what it feels like during the shift too. Like we could see on the radar that this thing was capable of killing people. And we just knew that the thing was making a direct beeline for Mayfield. And like, this is bad, and it was. It was a direct hit on downtown Mayfield. And well, this is what we do. You just have to do your job. Despite the fact that people are getting killed and whatnot, you just do your job. Get that message out there. And so just kind of showing that powerful effect and kind of the human side of what Derek just talked about, of how it really did kind of sit with people. And that's like something you have to work with too in your job. But also how it affected the community. And just kind of a note here from the public, someone just kind of said it flatly, like everyone's got PTSD now. You know, this is 4 months later and we're still sitting with this. Every time you see a warning, you react differently. You know, like they were much more serious about things. And I was actually doing an interview with one of the emergency managers, and there was severe weather when we were doing this last spring. And the police official comes in for the small town and is like, should we cancel school? You know, should we send people home? It's coming. What's it gonna look like? And, you know, she kind of calmed her down, like things should be fine, and then told me a story about how they were a couple months like after the December 10th, 11 events, they had a really windy day, and just talking about how people started to experience the PTSD. You know, kids started freaking on the bus, like, is this happening again? Is this happening again? Is it going to be like December 10th? And that being a sentiment that people like really like sat with them and worked pretty hard on it. But kind of summing this all up and thinking about where we're going and what the kind of overall takeaways are from this part of the research here and what the communication environment looked like. And so what the factors we found that are pretty important here is that the formal and informal communication pathways are crucial, but they vary throughout the event. You know, so it kind of depended on when you're talking about how important something was, but also the sense of strong relationships among and within the groups played a really strong role in communication, right? So talking about how like the Paducah office really understands their partners well, knows how to reach them, like calls and texts are going to be great. And that was a really key pathway. And then also I think too, community cohesion and understanding, just the idea of, you talked to a lot of people being like, we call the person that's never watching the weather, we do these types of things, or we're like, we're going to help out and you can stay at my house until things are kind of taken care of until you get off your feet, was also pretty key for how they like led up to the event, but also then I think how people responded to it. And then thinking about how this relates to the physical environment too. You know, so this is an event where there's a strong signal, the long lead time, and that really does change the communication because you have a different type of kind of influence on what you're able to say. And so when you can have a broadcaster on air being like, it's coming right for your neighborhood, and have this with confidence, and you have pictures of what it looks like, it's a very different message, and I think this could happen around this area. And so just knowing that impacted how people talked about it and how you were able to communicate. And then thinking too, the severity of it, and kind of just, and all the pictures that you've seen on the side of these slides are from, you know, my time months after, just how devastating this was for people. That also changed things. You know, being able to see kind of the impacts of severe weather has definitely changed how people relate to it, but also knowing that this was really big and really severe made it easier to talk about and having kind of more of that confidence leading up to it. So those are the main takeaways here too. And I know we haven't had a lot of questions or chat, but I'm also really interested in hearing what everyone else thinks. Kind of if there's anything I'm missing, or if you have comments or questions, there's a lot more data I haven't talked about. Because I think that, you know, while I could come in and say what some of these things look like, I'd really love to hear some of that operational perspective back. You know, if there's anything else we should dig into or look at or consider, I'd love to hear that too. But with that, yeah, time for any questions if you have them.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, so we have a good amount of time for questions. One that has come in is, did you have any interactions with EMs or other partners that were not directly impacted, but near misses, like a community just north-south of the path? And what are their viewpoints like of the entire process leading into, during, and after the event?
Yeah, so I did talk to a few, so I had a range of levels of impact, you know, so where some people had like their town really hit, you know, where some people had, like, went through a corner of their like county, and some people who were near misses, but they were on, so they would be on the western side. And so they were just like, I think a little north and a little west of it. And they talked about, they essentially followed the exact same process that the other EMs were talking about, right? So we're looking at, you know, leading up to it, I have my TV. I think someone talked about like the command center comes home. Like I have my TV with like each of the broadcasts on it for my area, the TV watching. I have like NWS chat if I can have it up, and like the National Weather Service page, and looking across and seeing what's happening and just kind of tracking. I think one person said they used NWS chat to know that they were safe. right? So like it had passed them and it was like talking about where things were going. It's like, okay, I kind of did the math and watching TV and like, I should be fine. It just didn't open the EOC is the difference. But they think that they were also, I think, very thankful in a way. You know, like they think they had very similar, like we really respect, we have great relationships with the Paducah office and we appreciate that. But then I think also, I think a different level of, I think guilt is the wrong word, but someone trying to talk, like try to explain the experience, like it's kind of weird where you're like really thankful, but you also feel really bad for the people who did get hit, right? So most of it's, the structure is exactly the same, except for just deciding that you're okay, and then communicating that you're okay, versus everyone else had to communicate, what do we do now? So the messages sorts of changes based on like on what you have to do, if you're hit or not, if that makes sense. That's a good question though. Did the same thing for public interviews too. Like some people who were like, you know, it was near my city and were affected, and some people who lost their whole homes. And so very, you know, different levels on that deliberately.
When you were interviewing the public, what was the main source for finding out about the warnings or that the storm was approaching them?
People were pretty different. You know, overall, people tended to see like, you know, you got the buzz about a week ahead of time, like in the week leading up to it. And some people reported just like on social media, like everyone was, I think someone was like, everyone's freaking out on social media. And so that's how I knew to watch it, or I kind of was aware. Some people had to get calls because there was someone whose parents went to Florida, and it's like, hey, are you watching the weather? Looks like it's going to be Friday. And that actually happened a couple of times, like people were watching it. Other people follow meteorologists on social media. I think just getting it from Twitter and those types of sources. The TV was plugging it too and kind of mentioning that it could be coming. And so people kind of mentioned getting it in their routine through one of those ways, like, you know, internet broadcast, hearing it from someone type of system days in advance. And then I think that makes people tune in a little bit more. And then it's really complicated. It's not like one source of information that was important. People kind of talked about like you heard a little bit about it, and then, you know, you evaluate whether it was really coming for you or not was the next decision. There's a lot of different kind of tipping points that make people take behavior. It's not like one single point. It's a lot of communication that builds up to one sort of like decision on what you do, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, it certainly sounds like it helped having advanced knowledge, you know,
Totally.
a week or so in advance, being able to watch it versus, you know, maybe an event that escalated quicker.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think that really made a difference, just being able to kind of have not only just like there's some hype and attention, but it also made a difference for and talking with the core partners, where then like an emergency managers, like I have time to like kind of check in with the mayor and say, here's what's going on, here's some potential. I have a chance to kind of reach out and talk to people. And so maybe I'm not doing anything specifically, but I'm starting to like kind of get things rolling, you know, kind of prime the pump, if you will, beforehand, which is important for them, having that time. So that when it is go time, people are ready, not like, wait, what, how sure are you? So kind of having that time, I think, was really key for them too.
And do you have any plans to further this work, or are you looking into any other kinds of events?
So generically, yes, but I'm also a postdoc, which is early career. And so most of that's going to be working with my excellent mentor, Julie, and kind of seeing how we develop more of this communication environment idea, kind of putting all these pieces together to understand that system, something I'm really excited about. You know, we have these for big events, but what does it matter? Like, what does this look like? And what are the factors that are key in maybe different communities for big events? You know, this is a really specific type. Maybe it's different factors in the bigger city, or maybe it's different factors with your relationship changing to severe weather and how often you see it. But then also thinking about what happens if it's not, like the environment's different. It's not as big of a signal. How does this communication landscape play out? Are things that I'm interested in and digging into a little bit more.
Neat. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions or raised hands. So thank you so much, Chris, and I'll go